Hello, freedom loving people, and welcome to another episode of the Restricted Handling Podcast. Today, with myself, Ryan, and Glenn. Glenn, you're calling in from a different location. Where are you today?
Yeah. Hi, Ryan. And hello, Emad. I am calling in from the Institute of World Politics from their media studio, where I'm sitting in the media studio with my main man, Alfred Rickett, who runs the studio and was kind enough to let us use their studio tonight for this podcast. So thank you, IWP, and thank you, Alfred.
And to all those students who get a class from you later, I am still jealous, and I hope they appreciate the legend that they have as a professor. But today we're here to talk all about Iran, and we could not have had a better guest, Emad Shargi. Emad, you've been featured on national, international programs, so some people may have heard of you already. The number 97010. What does that mean, and could that be our kicking off point for this, please?
97010 was the code that the IRGC intelligence agency gave me on the morning of April 24th, 2018, when they took me, stripped me of all my belongings, fingerprinted me, and unceremoniously threw me into a solitary cell with no running water, no toilet, 3 blankets, a PET bottle of water, and a number written on it, 97010. A few days later, I found out that that was my code, and I would no longer be known by my name or last name.
You spent years inside Evin Prison. Can you just get people up to speed with your background and what happened before you went into the prison? And then we'd love to just dig into Iran and what's going on today.
Sure. I left Iran in August of 1978 to go to boarding school in England. So I would get used to the idea of one day actually going for education away. And in 1982, I came to the U.S. I was home for a couple of months. Then I got accepted at the University of Maryland in College Park. I went there for 4 years, did an undergrad in economics. I went straight into George Washington University to do a master's in management information systems. I started up my own startup, I guess. At the time, that word didn't exist. And I started representing U.S. chemical companies in various Middle Eastern countries. So what I would do is I would go out to Saudi Arabia, to Riyadh, to Jeddah. I would go to Oman. I would go to UAE, to Egypt, to Syria, to Yemen. I would get a car and a driver in the morning. I would go to the industrial park. We would drive around slowly. Any plant that I saw that was a silo that stored plastics, I would knock on the door. Suit and tie, I would say, I'm here from the US, would go in. 90% of the time, I would get to see the owner. I would tell them, what is it that you're buying from the Europeans? What can I do to give you a better price and better service? And that's how I started that business.
Okay. And I think this is, if we come up to what's going on today, significant protests in Iran, a lot of it economically driven, but also just a lot of repression that we're seeing, deaths of protesters. You have seen this many times before, Emad, with green protests in 2009, some other economic ones, 2017, 18, 19, and obviously you were inside for some of that. Just to give people an idea of what's going on the ground, especially with your career as a businessman. What do you make of it this time around? Is it different than some of the other protests we've seen?
I think this is completely different than anything we've seen since the inception of the Islamic Republic. For the first time, these protests and uprisings are not geared to one group or a couple of large cities. They're organic. They're percolating from the bottom, and they cover all areas of society. I think once and for all, the Iranian people are sick and tired of living in poverty with no social justice. This is by far the worst kind of government a country can get. Look, even in North Korea, you could go out on a Friday night with your girlfriend, and nobody will stop you on the street if you're having a beer. You have no freedom in Iran. There is no future. There is nothing for people to look at for the future of their kids.
Yeah, Emad, it's great to see you again. And for our listeners, I was just saying I had the pleasure of hearing a public talk that Emad gave on resilience and what he went through, and I would highly recommend it. Emad, you mentioned when we were together at dinner that, you eventually went back to Iran to do business in Iran. And I remember you saying initially you felt very comfortable, the people were welcoming. My question for you is this, because I agree with you. I think this is different than it's been before. And maybe for the first time in a long time, there's real hope that there will be change and that this heinous regime will collapse. But what comes next, in your opinion? If you're an American, a U.S. policymaker or European policymaker, what are you thinking? Like, what should we be thinking about for the future of Iran? And how do we take advantage of the collapse of a regime which has been suppressing its people for so long? And how do we translate that into progress and prosperity for the Iranian people?
Well, first of all, I have to say that the Islamic Republic is a misogynistic, theocratic kleptocracy. They need to leave the scene. There are very bright people, some of whom were my prison mates, who were in the government of, for example, President Khatami. There's a gentleman by the name of Tajzadeh, secular, democratic vision of how he wants this country to be. There are other people like the Crown Prince Reza Pahlavi, who has on numerous times has said that he wants to be the agent for the change and transition. But ultimately, at the end of the day, it is the Iranian people who entered this social experiment 47 years ago. And I think a vast majority of them, upward of 90%, are regretful of what has happened during those 47 years. I mean, gentlemen, look, you have all traveled in the Middle East. Look where Iran is today, and look where some of its neighbors are. We have gone back about 100 years in everything. I mean, in 1972, you could take an Iran Air flight from Tehran to New York on a 7SP. Now we just don't have anything.
Right. One follow-on question. Some people say here in Washington, they're concerned that if there is a collapse of the regime, there'll be chaos in Iran. They liken it to Iraq after the U.S. removal of Saddam Hussein. What do you think about that? What is your assessment?
I think that is not quite accurate. I think one of the mistakes that we did is we went and disbanded all the social fabric of Iraq and expected everybody to wake up the next morning and want to have a democratic society and go vote for their representative. That is not the case with Iran. I think if you allow this regime to fall, there probably will be a short-term upheaval, but I think there are enough institutions in Iran that they can manage to get through the initial few months of upheaval.
Thank you.
Emad, do you think the U.S. intervening on behalf of Iran in some way? President Trump has mentioned that we're approaching U.S. red lines. He would like to support the freedom of the protesters. Would that help or hinder progress in Iran?
Well, the regime is going to spin it regardless. Would it be helpful? Yes. Has it been helpful? Yes. Has President Trump done the right thing? Yes. I think the Obama administration dropped the ball in 2009 with the Green Movement. Not a single word came out of the White House. That was a mistake. I think President Trump is bright enough. He knows who he's dealing with. He's dealt with contractors in New York, and these guys, he knows what he's doing.
Hey, I'm from New York. What are you doing there, Emad? Like, what's wrong with New Yorkers?
Nothing much, but
good point.
You know what I'm saying.
Yeah. No, good point.
Glenn, maybe question to you. I mean, just regionally, how does Turkey factor into this? We often talk about Turkey and its outsized impact. You mentioned just some of the nationalities within Iran. Does Turkey factor in at all in this discussion?
A great question, Ryan. I mean, I would say yes. First of all, they share a common border. The Turks are very concerned with instability. They've had a number of, they had the Syria civil war for years, large influx of refugees. By the way, this is Ottoman history. They've had, from the Balkans, from the Caucasus. There's a large Iranian population in Turkey today. Many Iranians fled that regime that we're talking about and moved to Turkey and are living in Istanbul. The Turks would love to see a change of regime because they know how dangerous the Islamic Republic is. And they're just worried about instability. And this is one of the reasons I asked Emad this question. I personally agree with him. I think that the institutions and the culture goes way back. I mean, the culture in Iran is incredible. And the system of education, I think even as hard as the Islamic Republic tried, or the supreme leader and his people tried, they couldn't destroy this tradition. And so I'm not expecting major instability. The Turks, of course, will also, if there is a change, will be in a great position to help capitalize on that change. It should be a bridge. Of course, now Iran and Turkey traditionally have been rivals, the Ottoman Empire, the Persian Empire. And so there'll be maybe some competition, but I think that would be healthy competition. And then other countries in the region are all watching very closely. They've had to live with the threat coming out of Tehran for a long time. And I'm sure they're hoping that this threat comes to an end and then they'll have a neighbor, which can be a good neighbor, more akin to what, Emad left and his family left than what they've gotten in their place, which was this Islamic regime, which has been threatening its neighbors with its axis of resistance and all its proxies. And then its quest to build a nuclear weapon to project its power in the region.
What about Russia, Glenn? I mean, we've talked about at length on this show what they failed to do in Syria, protecting Assad. Assad now resides somewhere in Russia. We just saw with Venezuela, another one of these states that thought they may have had some protection. They can't even protect one of their vessels transiting international waters. What would happen if Iran falls? Would they take in any of the leadership? How do you think Russia would play this?
Well, there's some media reporting that people are already fleeing to Russia. Some of the IRGC family members, people connected with the Supreme Leader are leaving. There is some reporting that the Supreme Leader himself has a plan to go to Russia if things get really bad. Some people have opined that may be disinformation put out by a certain government in the region to create more instability. So I can't really comment on the accuracy of the credibility of that reporting. I would say that Putin is probably very concerned right now because this would be another ally in his axis of what I call the axis of evil that would collapse. And we saw in Venezuela, the Russians were unable to do anything to help Maduro. We saw in Syria that they were unable to help their ally Bashar al-Assad, who was also a heinous terrorist, in my opinion. And now we'll see, the Russians, they don't have the economic throwaway to help the Iranian regime right now. Militarily, I think I said this before, Putin's in a tough spot because he has to be very careful not to upset President Trump because of the delicacy of the issue in Ukraine. The country I'm really watching is the People's Republic of China. There has been some reporting that the Chinese have said that they will get involved to help the regime. I haven't been able to verify that. Maybe Emad has heard something about that. I don't know.
The Chinese are very busy right now in Africa. I know that there were concessions made by the Iranian government to the Chinese to build ports in the Persian Gulf. Well, if the regime goes, China stands to lose all of those concessions.
Would you be surprised of leadership fleeing to Russia?
Look, it's possible that Ali Khamenei, his sons, few others might get over the border to Russia. But there is a large structure of the regime that cannot go anywhere. They cannot go to Europe. They cannot go to Syria anymore. They cannot go to Lebanon. And frankly, I don't think Mr. Putin wants to have 5,000-6,000 members of the IRGC roaming around Moscow, although it will be very good for the Airbnb business in Russia. They can get a room or a house next to Bashar al-Assad and have a great old time. No, I don't think, and that's what is worrisome, because even if the leadership leaves, the Basij and the IRGC that are still there, they are going to fight for their survival. And I see this as a quite brutal uprising, either way.
Yeah, so when you talk about the Basij, Emad, can you talk a little bit for our audience, like what is the Basij? What is the level of education? What is like their driving motivation? And are they, the members of the Basij and the IRGC, are these elements that a new regime could work with? Or do you think that they're so entrenched in the old thinking that they'll never change?
Well, let's start with the Basij. The Basij is an organization that does the dirty work internally for the IRGC. They're controlled, they're funded, they're armed. Command and control comes from the IRGC. Every time there is unrest, they unleash these thugs on the people. If you recall, back in Haiti, there was Tonton Mako, I think they were used to be called under Duvalier, Papa Duck.
Mm-hmm.
These guys basically act in the same way. They come on the street and they bludgeon people, they have guns, and it's a feeding school for the IRGC. So once you climb through the Basij, you get promoted inside the IRGC. Are there people within the IRGC that potentially could come out, be reformed? Perhaps. But I feel like a lot of them, especially at the top, have drank the Kool-Aid. This is like Jonestown.
So you think they're so indoctrinated, there's no change?
I think the top layer, yes. I think, it's a large organization. I'm sure there are people in there who could potentially come, be reformed, or want reform. They have seen what 47 years of this regime has done to this country. What does Iran have to show for 47 years? They got about 1,000 ballistic missiles, half of which doesn't reach their own border and fizzles out. They have a nuclear power industry that cannot power a small village. They've spent billions of dollars on proxies all over the Middle East, and they have nothing to show for it. Hezbollah is gone, Hamas is gone, the Houthis are gone, Assad is gone. What has this investment in this 47 years done to the people of Iran? And then to add insult to injury, 2 weeks ago, the regime decides that they can quell the uprising by offering each Iranian $7 a month in subsidies. Now, the Iranian people are not stupid. They know that each Hezbollah fighter gets $1,800 a month from the Islamic Republic. Where has the money gone? Where is the infrastructure? Where are the trains that they were supposed to build? The trains that they're still using, the train station in Tehran that still exists was built under Reza Shah 90 years ago.
Yeah.
You know, they haven't built one stadium. They haven't done anything for this country.
Yeah.
Let's say that there is some type of regime change, or at least the current leadership flees, or protesters somehow force them out. Who goes in there next? Would the U.S. ever venture in to try to put troops on the ground to stabilize? Is there another country in the region that would be more acceptable? Would we wait it out? I think at least in Syria, you had al-Shara moving in with forces to occupy. Doesn't seem like there's a unified individual within the groups that protest now. Emad, you mentioned the Crown Prince. Like, does he have enough to reconstitute in Iran?
I think there is a certain amount of nostalgia currently taking place in Iran. There are people who were born after the revolution, and now they're, chanting Pahlavi's name. He has said that he wants to become a transitional figure, but I am sure within Iran, there are people who understand what a democratic society looks like. They have certainly seen the other side of it, and they don't want any part of it. They want a civil society, secular society, and I think there are enough people within Iran that can pick up the mantle and move forward.
Emad, I'm not sure if you've seen these poly markets as they're described. It's almost like sports betting on real events in the world. I have no share in any of these, but they are now betting on coups and world events. One of them is, will the Ayatollah remain in power after January 31st? There's $17 million at play just over this one discussion topic, with 82% saying he will not be in power by the end of January, which I just find somewhat sad that that's the world we live in, that we will bet on these types of things. From what you've seen, understanding of the people, do you see something like this happening in the next month or so?
Well, I have another idea for this outfit, and that is, what are the chances that the U.S. would get somehow involved in the next week to 10 days?
They have that.
They have that? Okay, well, there we go.
Or U.S. strikes Iran by January 31st, is a 51% think it will happen.
If I was a betting man, I would take that.
Interesting. All right. We are not giving betting advice on here in case anybody is trying to regulate, but you could see that happening, Emad.
I could see that happening. I could see the regime falling by the 31st of January. You look back in history and you look at some of these dictators, nobody ever thought they would leave. And it takes 24 hours, 48 hours, and things change very, very quickly.
Right. Syria is a great example. I mean, nobody saw that coming as quickly as it happened, right? After years of civil war where the opposition was making no progress or very little progress. And then, as you said, Bashar al-Assad's living in an Airbnb in Moscow somewhere. And by the way, I should say that Ryan correctly bet at the end of he didn't bet, I'm sorry. He predicted at the end of the year that the U.S. would take military action in Venezuela. I said we wouldn't. He said we would, and he was right. Now, I said the Iranian regime would fall this year in 2026. So I hope it happens because I have to be even with Ryan. Plus, I have to say that because my doctor is Iranian-American, and he's the one that told me. He did tell me back in November, he said that by January 2026, the supreme leader would be out of power?
Well, I might have to change my doctors. You look back 47 years, the value of the Iranian currency has gone down 2 million%. The average income for an Iranian is about $330 a month. Inflation, Iranian government itself says it's 42%. Most analysts think it's above 50. Inflation in food is 70%. I mean, people are having a tough time making ends meet. It's, you have 0.5% of wealthy people there, and then everybody else. The middle class has vanished. There's no such thing anymore. 55% live below a poverty line. So all the elements is there for a major change to take place sooner than later.
Emad, with all your business experience in the region, what you know of Iran, I mean, the opportunity there, should it change regime, just the doors it could open economically with trade, I have to imagine are staggering for someone with your background who's just lived in the business environment in the Middle East for so long.
Back in 2016, 15, 16, when they were talking the JCPOA, I was living in Abu Dhabi at the time, and I would go to Tehran for a week visit. Everybody that I knew from Europe, around the world, was in Tehran. All the hotels were full. I mean, there was not enough room for people. The people were staying at the guest houses. In the UAE, if there was a meeting or a trade show, as soon as they would find out you were Iranian, they would pull you aside and say, let's plan something for when things open up. Yes, it's a virgin market. Nothing has been done for 47 years. I mean, anything you can do in that country, you will make money.
How about Emad, like the Iranian-American community here? Like, it must be a great deal of excitement and obviously, concern for family that's still inside of Iran, which is probably consistent with, what's been going on for years. Do you feel like a lot of energy right now at the community?
I think so. I think that the Iranian diaspora are, on the whole, and they have been like this over the years, they mind their own business. They're mostly very successful in whatever they have done. Most of my friends are lawyers and doctors, and they don't get involved in the day-to-day activities of the Islamic Republic or Iran. When things like this happen, yes, they become excited, but I feel like they've been led to the water's edge a few times, that they've come back thirsty. So some of them are a bit more jaded, and they're like, this regime will never go. But one has to be optimistic. Things will happen. The great Soviet empire fell after 70 years, and the Islamic regime will fall. This month, next month, this year, next year, guarantee you.
And there was so much, even with Afghanistan, we should say, we were certain it wouldn't move that fast when we pulled out of Afghanistan with all the intelligence we could have ever had, and it happened so fast. Emad, some of the reasons that give me pause and maybe something more will happen as you look back in 2009 or 17 or 18, and it just seemed like there was such momentum and groundswell, but this regime is so effective at repression, whether it's economic handouts or just pure physicality, throttling or cutting off the internet entirely for information flow. And nobody knows that better than you. Having been inside Evin Prison, does it give you any hope with what's happening now that they might somehow back away from the people?
I was in Evin when Mahsa Amini was killed and the protests took over the country. I got to see some of the people who were arrested and brought in. I also saw the sense of hope and optimism that spread all over the prison amongst the political prisoners. Now, I was not a political prisoner, I was just a product for the Iranian regime to sell. But I would see the political prisoners, their mood changed, and they were the ones who set fire to the buildings around us and the one that I was in. Sitting there, I was so happy and so hopeful that when we heard people screaming outside, death to the dictator, that was amazing to be sitting in Evin Prison. Actually, they came and they took me from Ward 8 and they took me to 2A, which is the IRGC's own facility. And I was there with one of my fellow Americans for 2 weeks because we were taken there for safekeeping. They didn't want their product to get damaged. But we would hear at night, death to Khamenei, death to the dictator, on. And this would go on night after night after night. So It didn't happen that time. I'm hopeful it'll happen this time.
One last question from me, Emad. Can you, like, again, our audience may not track, Iran issues closely all the time. So Ryan mentioned earlier in the podcast the different nationalities in Iran. Can you just give like an overview of what makes up Iranian society today in terms of ethnicity, and then the religious groups, and then if there's any groups that you think are significant to watch for people as we watch the situation develop?
Well, in Iran, we have large minority of Kurds to the northwest of the country. And in the south, we have Sunni Arabs in Khuzestan. And most of the Kurds to the northwest are also Sunnis. We have about 20 million Azeri, Turkish-speaking Azeris in Iran. And then to the southeast of the country is Baluchistan, and again, a Sunni enclave there. And you have the Farsi speakers. So yes, out of the 19 million, you can carve the country up. I would say about 65 million of it are different minorities. We have majority Shias and a large majority of Sunni Muslims.
You had mentioned earlier that it might be helpful for the U.S. to be involved. What would you see as helpful in that world? And then, Glenn, I'll probably come to you as we round out here. Like, if you were advising the administration in some capacity, what would you be suggesting? But Emad, over to you. What would be useful, you think?
There is definitely one thing the U.S. can do, and that's to take out the Islamic Republic's broadcasting network. One of the hardest part of being incarcerated in Iran was watching that garbage every night, an orgy of lies and hate that came out of the TV every night. And that's the regime's way of getting across to people. Shut that down somehow.
Fascinating. And Glenn, I mean, you watched the Soviet Union collapse in different way, and people who stood down when they could have stood up and vice versa. But curious, Glenn, for your take on this.
Well, I always tell the story, but as the Soviet Union was collapsing, a Russian or a Soviet guy who I met randomly, I asked him, I said, what should the United States do? And he said, just be the symbol for hope, right? I think President Trump now has come out and said, and I give him credit, he's taken a very forward-leaning position, whereas previous administrations were much more hesitant. As Emad said, we didn't really do anything during the Green Revolution. I think that was a missed opportunity to change that regime and the behavior that was coming out of Iran. I think President Trump is now kind of in the position where he's going to have to do something because, unfortunately, the regime is using force and violence against its own people, which he kind of indicated would be the litmus test for this administration. I like the idea of cutting out their ability to produce propaganda. They shut down the internet. Somebody should take away their voice. I also think there are probably, it's just my own assessment, but strategic targets that could be hit to send a message to the people that we are with you. I think one of the reasons we're here right now, it's not the main reason, but what happened during the 13-day war this summer showed a lot of people that the regime had, the emperor had no clues, and that they weren't as powerful or all powerful maybe as they tried to present themselves internationally. And it maybe started, inspiring people to think like maybe this is the time. And we could probably do some things, if it were me, to send a message to the Basij, to the IRGC, and then maybe to the army leadership, the Artesh, to let them know, like, if you get involved further, it'll be worse. But then we should also offer some kind of carrot, in my opinion. And the president's message should be, and I think he's already said this, the Iranian people are amazing people, and we want to have a good relationship. And there's so much to benefit for the United States and for the people of Iran if you change this regime. And the people that are in the government now, many of them just, when they get the orders to shoot on their own people, they need to put their weapons down or turn their weapons on the people giving them those orders and shoot those people. I don't know if I can say that on a podcast.
Yeah.
But that's what has to happen. The security forces need to, in Russia, what happened, if you remember, Yeltsin got on the tank outside the White House, and that was kind of a huge moment because the guy that had the orders to fire on his own people refused to fire. And that spreads pretty quickly.
Indeed. But, one of the things is I find distasteful personally is how do you negotiate with the Islamic Republic that has on its hand American servicemen's blood? Can you reform this regime? I don't know.
Yeah, that's a great question. And many of these people do have the blood of Americans on their hands and others, and a lot of their own innocent people who just got terrorized by them.
Well, I think what's happening right now, I think Mr. Khamenei has become more delusional about his own power. I think it's probably the strain of having to check into a new bomb shelter every night for 6 months. But, he's cracking down on the street once more. And you look back in history, all the way back, anytime a leader has done that, it's come back to haunt them.
Right. Yeah. Hey, one last question. Your assessment of the president, because he seems to be taking a much more moderate line.
Which president in Iran?
Yeah, the president of Iran.
Is a non-factor. Presidents in Iran they're like a glorified mayor.
So no influence.
No, zero.
Okay. Interesting.
Before we end, we should mention just Israel. Glenn, you mentioned, fighting over the summer. Any prediction or thoughts on how Israel is going to play this?
Yeah. No, I mean, my understanding is that Benjamin Netanyahu has said that they're going to stand down. I think that's very smart, because I think if the Israelis get too involved, it will have the opposite effect. Which is something we have to be careful of as well, because we don't want to stir this nationalist feeling to end up supporting the regime which we want to see go. So, it's my own assessment. The Israelis, they don't need to do a repeat of what they did this summer unless they see some real national security threat to Israel. Now, the regime has said that they will strike Israel and they will strike U.S. military bases in the Middle East if they feel that they're being threatened. And of course, if they do strike Israel, or if they attempt to strike Israel, that may be a game changer. But right now, I think this is just my assessment. The Israeli government is taking the right tact here.
Yeah, I agree. But I also think that in Iran, they don't quite understand military parity. They don't understand scales. So when you talk to them, you're like, look, our gross national product for last year is like $430 billion. One department in the US government. This year, the proposed budget for the Pentagon is $1.5 trillion. I mean, you're not comparing apples to apples. They don't get that. They have come up with a narrative, this lie that they give out every night to the population, and they have believed it.
Now, that's an interesting point. This is just a bigger point. We all have to be careful about living in an echo chamber, right? Which we see this in Russia with Putin. He's been in an echo chamber that probably led him to this disastrous decision to expand his invasion of Ukraine, which is now a war that's lasted longer than the Second World War or the German invasion of the Soviet Union. The Iranian regime, anybody, including, we're not, by the way, it could happen in the United States. If you only listen to one set of news, or you only listen to the kind of people that think the way you think, you're probably putting yourself in a bad position.
One of the things I did when I came back from Iran is I made a decision not to go on social media. So I get my news from still various newspapers, keep it simple.
Just to avoid that type of echo chamber or Emad or propaganda?
I just don't want to find myself going down rabbit holes constantly. And to what Glenn said, because you tend to veer towards your own point of view. And soon, all you're listening to is that echo chamber that Glenn was talking about.
Yeah. Emad, thank you so much for the time. Any last words before we wrap?
Well, I think the Iranian people deserve far, far better than what they have gotten in the last 47 years. And the region deserves even more. Wherever this regime has gone, it has brought death, destruction, and misery with it. It's time for a change.
Amen. Ryan, you start each podcast with freedom-loving people. We are seeing now incredibly courageous people in Iran go to the streets and challenge a regime which has used force over and over again, lethal force against them and their relatives. So God bless them and God protect them and give them strength. And let's, as Americans, remember that, and let's be there for them now.
Yeah. Thank you so much, gents. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for listening and being a part of the RH community. Would you like to receive the same daily intel brief that Glenn and I read? You can get it for free at restrictedhandling.com. We've curated what we consider to be the most relevant and reputable sources on all things international security, geopolitics, military and intel ops, and economics and sanctions, focused exclusively on Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, and the Middle East, to include accompanying podcasts for Russia, China, economics, and spy stories. Just head to restrictedhandling.com, enter your email, and you'll get the daily briefs that Glenn and I both read, and you can leave comments and questions that we can respond to. Thanks again for listening. Stay safe.